They looked at the young woman standing at the front gate and decided she would never belong in their family. Before the evening was over, every quiet smile they dismissed would become another step toward a truth none of them were prepared to face. Emily Carter adjusted the sleeves of her light blue dress as she stood beside her husband, Daniel Brooks, outside the sprawling Brooks family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The late afternoon sun reflected off tall windows and polished stone columns, while perfectly trimmed hedges framed the winding driveway where luxury sedans gleamed like sculptures. Everything about the property whispered old money, careful tradition, and generations of privilege. Emily drew a slow breath, not because she was intimidated by the mansion itself, but because she understood that tonight she was not simply entering a home. She was stepping into a room where every glance would measure her before she ever spoke a word. Daniel reached for her hand and offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to impress anyone," he said quietly. Emily returned the smile with calm confidence. "I'm not here to impress them. I'm here because they're your family." Inside the house, crystal chandeliers bathed the grand foyer in warm golden light while portraits of Brooks' ancestors stretched across towering walls. Margaret Brooks watched from the top of the staircase before Emily even crossed the threshold. She noticed the simple dress first, then the modest shoes, then the lack of expensive jewelry. Her expression remained perfectly polite, yet behind her composed smile, she had already reached a conclusion. Richard Brooks stood beside the fireplace, silently observing, his years in finance having convinced him he could read people within seconds. Victoria Brooks barely looked up from the champagne glass in her hand before exchanging a knowing glance with her mother. No one said a cruel word. They didn't have to. Their eyes carried conversations of their own. Daniel introduced Emily warmly, but each greeting felt rehearsed, formal, almost transactional. Margaret embraced her son before extending a restrained handshake toward Emily. "We've heard so much about you," she said pleasantly. Daniel always did have a generous heart. Emily thanked her sincerely, choosing not to search for hidden meaning. She had spent enough of her life around people who confused kindness with weakness. A housekeeper quietly offered to take Emily's small handbag. Victoria smiled with practiced elegance. "You travel light," she observed. Emily nodded. "I've found life is easier when you only carry what matters." Victoria let out a soft laugh. "That's certainly one philosophy." Around them, conversations continued beneath sparkling lights, while waitstaff carried silver trays through the spacious rooms. Family friends, business partners, and longtime neighbors arrived one after another, dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. Emily greeted every guest with genuine warmth, remembering names after hearing them only once and thanking each server who passed nearby. Margaret noticed every interaction, but instead of seeing grace, she saw confirmation of what she already believed. To her, Emily looked comfortable with the staff because she belonged among them rather than beside the Brooks family. As dinner approached, Margaret gently touched Richard's arm and whispered just quietly enough that Emily could not hear. "She's pleasant," she murmured. "But pleasant isn't enough for this family." Richard gave the slightest nod without taking his eyes off Emily. Across the room, an elderly gentleman had quietly arrived without fanfare. Unlike everyone else, he did not study Emily's clothes or the simplicity of her appearance. He watched the way she listened when others spoke, the way she thanked every employee by name, and the calm confidence that never asked to be noticed. A faint smile crossed his face before he accepted a glass of sparkling water. He recognized something the Brooks family had completely overlooked, though he said nothing at all. Not yet. Dinner was announced with the quiet elegance that only generations of carefully preserved tradition could produce. A pair of polished oak doors opened into a dining room illuminated by candlelight reflecting across crystal glasses and fine china that had reportedly been in the Brooks family for nearly a century. Emily followed Daniel to her seat without hesitation, her posture relaxed and her smile sincere, while every subtle glance around the table suggested that the evening had become something more than a family meal. It had quietly transformed into an examination. Margaret lifted her wine glass with practiced grace. We always enjoy learning about the people who become part of this family, she said warmly. Emily, tell us about your parents. Emily folded her hands gently in her lap before answering. My father taught history at a public high school for 35 years, and my mother worked as a community librarian. They believed that kindness and education were the greatest gifts they could give. Margaret nodded politely, although disappointment briefly crossed her face. Victoria offered a smile that never reached her eyes. How wonderfully modest, she replied. Richard leaned back in his chair. Daniel mentioned you attended college. Emily smiled. Yes, I was fortunate to receive several scholarships. Richard gave a thoughtful nod before asking, and what business are you in now? I work with nonprofit organizations, Emily answered simply. Victoria exchanged another quick glance with her mother. That sounds rewarding, she said. Although I imagine it does not exactly pay the bills around here. Daniel immediately looked toward his sister. Emily has built an incredible career. Victoria shrugged with effortless confidence. I am sure she has. I simply meant that our family has always been deeply involved in business. We speak that language naturally. Emily never appeared offended. Every profession teaches its own language, she replied gently. Some happen to be measured in dollars. Others are measured in people. For the first time that evening, Richard paused before responding. There was something unexpectedly thoughtful about her answer, but before the moment could settle, Margaret smoothly redirected the conversation toward investment portfolios, international travel, and vacation properties. Emily listened attentively, asking genuine questions instead of trying to impress anyone with stories of her own. As dessert arrived, one of the newer servers accidentally brushed against the table while refilling coffee. A silver spoon slipped onto the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic sound that briefly interrupted every conversation in the room. The young employee immediately apologized, her face turning bright red as she bent down to retrieve it. Before anyone else moved, Emily quietly stood, picked up the spoon, handed it back with a reassuring smile, and softly said, "It happens to everyone. Please do not worry." Relief immediately appeared in the young woman's eyes. Margaret watched the exchange with quiet disapproval. To her, Emily's behavior seemed overly familiar, almost inappropriate for a formal family dinner. Victoria leaned toward her mother and whispered just loudly enough for Richard to hear, "She certainly knows how to make the staff feel comfortable." Neither woman noticed that the elderly gentleman seated near the far end of the table had observed the entire moment with careful attention. He remained mostly silent throughout dinner, speaking only when spoken to, yet his eyes never wandered far from Emily. Unlike everyone else, he noticed that she remembered every employee's name after hearing it only once. He noticed that she thanked each person sincerely without sounding rehearsed. Most importantly, he noticed that her kindness never changed whether she was speaking to the Brooks family or someone serving the meal. As coffee was poured and conversation drifted toward the following evening's charity gala, Margaret smiled across the table. "Tomorrow will be an important event for our family," she said. "Many influential people will be attending. First impressions matter more than ever." Emily returned the smile with complete composure. "I agree," she answered. "The way we treat people often becomes the impression they remember the longest." The room grew unusually quiet for a brief moment before conversation slowly resumed, yet none of the Brooks family realized how deeply those simple words would echo before the gala came to an end. The following afternoon arrived beneath a cloudless autumn sky as black luxury cars lined the circular driveway of the Brooks estate. The annual Brooks Foundation Gala had become one of the most anticipated charity events in Fairfield County, attracting business executives, civic leaders, philanthropists, and public officials from across New England. Elegant white tents stretched across the manicured gardens while soft string lights shimmered above stone walkways. Fresh flowers framed every entrance, and a string quartet welcomed arriving guests with quiet sophistication. Emily stepped from the house, wearing the same graceful simplicity that had unsettled the Brooks family since her arrival. Her navy evening dress was beautifully tailored but understated, free of flashy jewelry or designer logos. Margaret noticed immediately. "Emily," she said with careful politeness, This event gathers some of the most influential families in the region. You still have time to borrow something more appropriate. Emily smiled warmly. I appreciate your concern. I am comfortable exactly as I am. Victoria adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist before adding with a playful laugh, confidence is admirable. Let us just hope it is enough tonight. Daniel quietly reached for Emily's hand. You look beautiful, he whispered. Emily thanked him softly, refusing to let the remarks disturb her peace. As guests filled the garden, Margaret introduced relatives, investors, and longtime family friends one after another. Each introduction followed a familiar pattern. Daniel received praise for his business achievements. Richard was recognized for decades of financial leadership. Victoria discussed luxury developments and international investments. When it was Emily's turn, Margaret smiled graciously and said, "This is our newest family member, Emily. She prefers a much simpler way of life than the rest of us." Several guests nodded politely. Others offered sympathetic smiles that carried quiet assumptions. Emily greeted every person with genuine warmth, asking thoughtful questions instead of speaking about herself. Before long, Margaret quietly guided conversations elsewhere, leaving Emily standing alone more than once. None of it appeared accidental. Daniel noticed, but remained occupied greeting donors his parents considered essential to the foundation. Emily wandered toward the refreshment tables where several event staff hurried to prepare for the evening program. A young coordinator struggled with a stack of seating charts that suddenly scattered across the stone pathway as a gust of wind swept through the garden. Guests walked around the papers without slowing their conversations. Emily immediately knelt to help gather every page, carefully arranging them in numerical order before handing them back with an encouraging smile. "Thank you," the coordinator said with visible relief. "You probably just saved the opening ceremony." Emily answered gently, "Everyone needs an extra pair of hands sometimes." From across the lawn, Victoria observed the moment and quietly shook her head. "She always seems to find the staff," she muttered. Margaret sighed almost imperceptibly. Some habits are difficult to outgrow. Neither woman realized that the elderly gentleman from dinner had witnessed the exchange once again. Standing beneath a maple tree with a glass of sparkling water, he watched Emily help without hesitation and without checking whether anyone important happened to be watching. His expression softened as though another piece of a familiar puzzle had fallen into place. As sunset painted the sky with warm shades of gold and amber, the gala officially began. Hundreds of conversations blended beneath glowing lanterns, while photographers captured smiling guests near the grand entrance. Emily stood quietly beside Daniel, perfectly content to remain in the background, unaware that several pairs of eyes had begun watching her for entirely different reasons than the Brooks family imagined. The evening was unfolding exactly as Margaret had planned, yet somewhere beneath the polished elegance of the celebration, the first cracks in carefully held assumptions had already begun to appear. As twilight settled over the estate, the gala reached its busiest hour. Laughter drifted beneath glowing lanterns, while servers moved gracefully between small groups carrying polished silver trays. A jazz trio replaced the string quartet, filling the garden with soft melodies that blended naturally into conversations about investments, charities, and upcoming political campaigns. Emily stood quietly beside a stone fountain, listening more than speaking, perfectly content to let others occupy the center of attention. Margaret, however, had different plans. She approached with a polished smile and gently rested a hand on Emily's shoulder before guiding her toward a circle of distinguished guests. "Everyone," Margaret announced pleasantly, "I would like you to meet my new daughter-in-law, Emily. She comes from a very humble background, but Daniel has always believed character matters more than social standing." Several guests exchanged polite smiles. One woman tilted her head sympathetically before asking Emily where she had grown up. Emily answered warmly, describing a quiet Connecticut town where neighbors still knew one another by name. Before she could say more, Victoria laughed softly. "It is quite a change from this world, is it not?" Emily met her eyes calmly. "Every community has something valuable to teach." Richard added with measured confidence, "The Brooks family has always operated on a rather different scale." Emily simply nodded. Every family builds its legacy differently. The conversation continued, yet Margaret subtly steered every topic toward wealth, influence, or prestigious connections. Questions about exclusive clubs, international resorts, private schools, and investment portfolios arrived one after another, less as genuine curiosity and more as carefully arranged hurdles. Emily answered honestly whenever appropriate and gracefully admitted when she had no personal experience with certain luxuries. She never pretended. She never exaggerated. She never appeared embarrassed. Ironically, her quiet honesty only strengthened the assumptions surrounding her. Nearby, a volunteer coordinating the evening's scholarship auction suddenly realized that one of the featured donors had been seated at the wrong table because two place cards had accidentally been switched. The mistake threatened to delay the program as guests began searching for their assigned seats. Several organizers hurried from table to table, speaking anxiously into headsets. Emily noticed the growing confusion and quietly walked over. After briefly examining the seating chart, she recognized that the alphabetical labels had been rearranged during setup. Within moments, she calmly suggested a simple correction that restored the original layout without disrupting the remaining assignments. The coordinator stared at her with visible relief. "How did you figure that out so quickly?" Emily smiled. Sometimes people become so focused on the problem that they stop looking at the pattern. Within minutes, the dining area returned to perfect order, and most guests never realized there had been an issue. Margaret observed Emily speaking with the volunteers and quietly sighed. "She certainly enjoys involving herself behind the scenes," she remarked. Victoria replied, "Perhaps that is where she feels most comfortable." Neither woman understood that several respected donors had witnessed Emily solve the situation while remaining completely anonymous. Among them stood the elderly gentleman, whose thoughtful eyes never left her for long. He listened as grateful volunteers thanked Emily repeatedly, and each quiet exchange seemed to confirm something he had suspected since the previous evening. Across the garden, Daniel finally managed to step away from a lengthy conversation with investors and joined Emily near the fountain. "Have they been giving you a difficult time?" he asked gently. Emily looked toward Margaret and Victoria, who were laughing with another group across the lawn. "They are still deciding who they think I am," she answered with a peaceful smile. Daniel frowned. "I wish they would simply get to know you." Emily's expression remained steady as warm lights reflected across the water behind them. Sometimes people have to finish writing their own story before they are willing to read someone else's. Unnoticed by either of them, the elderly gentleman quietly set down his glass and began walking toward the stage where the evening's keynote presentation would soon begin. The audience gradually gathered before the illuminated stage as the Master of Ceremonies welcomed everyone to the Foundation's annual celebration. Crystal chandeliers hanging beneath the elegant pavilion reflected warm golden light across hundreds of smiling faces, while servers quietly cleared the last dinner plates. Richard reviewed the evening program with visible satisfaction. Every speech, every presentation, and every recognition had been carefully planned weeks in advance. Margaret adjusted the microphone at the podium before greeting the audience with polished confidence. She thanked longtime donors, celebrated the Brooks family's charitable legacy, and invited everyone to continue supporting the causes that had become synonymous with their name. Applause echoed throughout the garden. Emily remained near the back beside Daniel, content to let others enjoy the spotlight. As Margaret introduced several distinguished guests, she eventually smiled toward the elderly gentleman who had quietly observed the entire evening. "We are especially honored to welcome Mr. Charles Whitmore," she announced. "Few people have shaped American philanthropy as profoundly as he has. Thank you for joining us tonight." Warm applause filled the pavilion as Charles slowly approached the stage with calm confidence. Though advanced in age, he carried himself with remarkable dignity, and his quiet presence immediately commanded the attention of every guest. Richard leaned toward Daniel and whispered proudly, "His foundation has transformed education across the country. Having him here is a tremendous honor." Charles thanked Margaret graciously before standing silently for a brief moment, allowing the applause to fade naturally. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but carried effortlessly across the crowd. This evening has reminded me that generosity is not measured by the size of a donation, but by the character behind every decision. Many guests nodded politely, expecting another inspiring fundraising speech. Instead, Charles looked away from the podium and slowly scanned the audience until his eyes settled on Emily. A faint smile crossed his face. "Before I continue," he said, "there is someone here I would like to recognize." The garden grew noticeably quieter. Emily looked around, assuming he must be referring to another guest. Charles raised one hand toward her. "Dr. Emily Carter, would you please join me?" For several long seconds, no one moved. Margaret blinked in confusion. Victoria frowned as she searched Emily's face for any sign that this had been planned. Richard looked toward Daniel, who appeared just as surprised as everyone else. Emily hesitated only briefly before walking toward the stage with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the evening. Hundreds of eyes followed her every step. Even the musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Charles welcomed her with genuine warmth. "It has been far too long since we shared a stage," he said kindly. Emily smiled. "It is wonderful to see you again, Charles." Their familiarity sent a ripple of whispers through the audience. Margaret felt her confidence begin to slip. Victoria's expression slowly shifted from amusement to uncertainty. Charles turned back toward the audience. "Many of you know me because of the Whitmore Education Initiative. What you may not know is that several years ago, our organization nearly abandoned one of the most ambitious literacy projects in the country because we simply could not solve its biggest challenges." He paused, looking proudly at Emily. The person who transformed that project was not a celebrity, not a politician, and certainly not someone seeking recognition. It was Dr. Emily Carter. The pavilion fell completely silent. Even the evening breeze seemed to disappear as every assumption carefully built over the previous 2 days began to crack beneath the weight of a single unexpected introduction. The silence lingered for several heartbeats before Charles Whitmore continued speaking, and every word seemed to carry greater weight than the last. "5 years ago," he said, "our foundation launched a nationwide literacy initiative for underserved communities. We had funding. We had volunteers. We had partnerships. What we lacked was a practical system that could actually reach the families who needed it most." He turned toward Emily with unmistakable admiration. Dr. Emily Carter designed that system. She reorganized an entire national program without asking for recognition, without requesting her name appear in a single press release, and without accepting the executive salary we offered her. A ripple of astonishment spread through the audience. Several guests exchanged bewildered glances while others instinctively reached for their phones, quietly searching Emily's name. Margaret remained perfectly still, her smile fading into complete disbelief. Victoria stared at Emily as though she were looking at a stranger. Richard slowly lowered the program he had been holding, unable to hide the surprise on his face. Charles continued, "Because of her leadership, more than 100,000 children gained access to reading programs that many experts believed could never be implemented successfully. Today, those programs continue in 34 states." He paused again before adding, "Every major organization involved knows her work. The remarkable part is that almost nobody knows her face because she has always believed that results matter more than recognition." The room remained completely silent. Emily accepted every compliment with quiet humility, never interrupting and never attempting to draw attention to herself. Daniel looked at his wife with tears beginning to gather in his eyes. Although he knew she had dedicated years to nonprofit leadership, even he had never heard Charles describe the full impact of her work in such extraordinary detail. Charles smiled gently. "Some of you may wonder why someone capable of leading international initiatives would choose such a simple life." He glanced toward Emily, who answered with a soft smile before he spoke again. "Because she once told me that the people she serves should never feel intimidated by the person trying to help them. She believes dignity begins with making others feel comfortable." Those words landed heavily throughout the pavilion. Margaret suddenly remembered Emily helping the housekeeper, comforting the event coordinator, thanking every server by name, and quietly solving problems no one else had noticed. Victoria recalled every sarcastic remark she had made about Emily always finding the staff instead of the important guests. Richard thought back to Emily's answer during dinner when she had calmly said that some professions were measured in people instead of dollars. None of those moments had seemed significant at the time. Now each memory returned with painful clarity. Charles looked directly at the Brooks family without sounding accusatory. Over the past 2 days, I have watched Dr. Carter do exactly what she has always done. She treated every person here with the same respect, whether they were hosting this event or serving dinner. That consistency is far rarer than intelligence, wealth, or influence. Several guests quietly applauded. The applause spread slowly across the audience until the entire pavilion echoed with genuine admiration. Emily remained composed, almost embarrassed by the attention, gently shaking her head as though the recognition belonged to countless others who had worked beside her over the years. When the applause finally softened, Charles stepped aside and invited Emily to address the audience. She walked toward the microphone with calm, unhurried steps. The Brooks family watched in complete silence, no longer seeing a simple young woman who had wandered into their world, but someone whose quiet character had revealed a greatness that could never be measured by appearances, titles, or wealth. Emily rested her hands lightly on the podium and waited until the applause faded into complete silence. The warm glow of the pavilion lights reflected across hundreds of attentive faces, yet she showed no trace of triumph. Instead, her expression carried the same quiet kindness that had remained unchanged since the moment she first walked through the Brooks family's front door. "Thank you, Charles," she began softly. "The work you described has never belonged to one person. It belongs to every teacher who stayed late, every volunteer who gave up weekends, every parent who refused to give up on a child, and every community that believed hope was worth investing in." Her calm voice carried effortlessly across the garden. "I simply had the privilege of standing beside extraordinary people." The audience listened with complete attention. Emily continued, "Many people have asked me over the years why I rarely appear in interviews or accept public recognition. The answer has always been simple. If the person receiving help remembers my name instead of believing in their own future, then I have focused on the wrong thing." Several guests nodded thoughtfully. Charles smiled with quiet pride, as though he had expected no different. Emily glanced toward the volunteers who had spent the evening arranging tables, guiding guests, and serving meals. Every successful project I have ever worked on began with people who were often overlooked. The receptionist who welcomed families with kindness. The custodian who stayed after hours so children could learn in clean classrooms. The cafeteria worker who noticed when a student skipped lunch. Great communities are not built only by those standing on stages. They are built every day by people whose names rarely appear in headlines. Her words settled over the audience like a gentle reminder. Margaret felt her throat tighten as she remembered assuming Emily belonged with the staff simply because she treated them with warmth. Victoria lowered her eyes, suddenly embarrassed by every sarcastic remark she had whispered throughout the evening. Richard quietly replayed each conversation from dinner, recognizing how often he had measured success by titles instead of character. Emily offered a small smile before continuing. "I was fortunate to grow up in a family that never judged people by what they owned. My parents taught me that every person deserves the same respect before they have earned your admiration, because dignity should never depend on accomplishments." Those words struck the Brooks family more deeply than any public criticism ever could have. Emily could have exposed every insult she had endured since arriving at the estate. She could have reminded everyone how she had been quietly underestimated at every turn. Instead, she chose grace. She chose compassion. She chose to teach without humiliating anyone. The audience rose into another standing ovation, louder than the first. Daniel stood with tears shining in his eyes, applauding not because his wife had impressed an influential crowd, but because she had remained exactly the same woman he had fallen in love with. As the applause continued, several distinguished guests stepped forward to greet Emily personally. Business leaders thanked her for transforming communities they had only read about in reports. Educators spoke about literacy programs that had changed thousands of young lives. Foundation directors shared stories of partnerships they had proudly built with her over the years. Margaret watched every conversation unfold with growing disbelief. The woman she had quietly dismissed as too ordinary for the Brooks family was being welcomed by many of the very people whose respect she had spent decades trying to earn. In that unforgettable moment, the measure of true influence became impossible to ignore, and the greatest person in the garden was the one who had never once tried to appear important. When the applause finally settled into quiet conversations, the atmosphere across the estate had completely changed. Guests who had spent the evening discussing investments and influence now formed a respectful circle around Emily, eager to shake her hand or simply thank her for work that had touched lives far beyond Connecticut. Margaret remained near the front of the stage, unable to move. For the first time in many years, she found herself searching for the right words and discovering that none of them came easily. Richard slowly approached Emily with Daniel beside him. His usual confidence had disappeared, replaced by the humility of a man confronting his own mistaken judgment. "Emily," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The nearby conversation softened as several guests instinctively stepped back, giving the family a private moment despite standing in the middle of the crowded pavilion. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "I believed I understood people because I had spent decades evaluating businesses, negotiating partnerships, and making difficult decisions. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I could measure a person's worth almost immediately. I was wrong." Emily listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only patient attention. Margaret stepped forward next, her voice noticeably unsteady. "When Daniel introduced you to us, I saw your clothes before I saw your character. I heard your background before I listened to your heart. Every compliment I offered carried judgment beneath it. Every question I asked was another attempt to decide whether you belonged in this family." Tears gathered in her eyes. "The truth is that it was never you who needed to earn our acceptance. It was we who needed to become worthy of your kindness." Victoria stood silently for several moments before taking a slow breath. "I thought confidence came from expensive things," she admitted. "Tonight I realized real confidence never needs to announce itself." She managed a small, embarrassed smile. "I am ashamed of the jokes I made and the assumptions I whispered. You answered every one of them with grace instead of anger." Emily looked at each member of the Brooks family before speaking. "I appreciate your honesty more than you know." She paused gently. "We all make assumptions. The important question is whether we allow those assumptions to become permanent." Margaret looked at her hopefully. "Can you forgive us?" Emily smiled with the same quiet warmth she had shown every person throughout the evening. Forgiveness becomes much easier when people are willing to change. She glanced toward the volunteers who were already clearing tables as guests prepared to leave. Character is not revealed by one perfect evening. It is revealed by what we choose to do tomorrow. Charles Whitmore watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Daniel reached for Emily's hand, grateful that she had responded with compassion instead of resentment. Around them, several guests who had witnessed the conversation exchanged thoughtful glances of their own. They had arrived expecting another elegant charity gala. Instead, they had witnessed something far more valuable. Margaret turned toward one of the event coordinators and personally thanked every volunteer she passed on her way through the pavilion. Richard stopped to shake hands with servers whose names he had never bothered to learn before that night. Victoria quietly helped gather and used auction materials without being asked. They were small actions, almost invisible against the elegance of the evening, yet Emily noticed each one. Real transformation rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. More often, it began with simple choices repeated one quiet moment at a time. 1 month later, the Brooks family gathered again, but this time the destination was not a grand estate or an elegant ballroom. Emily had invited them to spend the day at one of the community learning centers supported by the literacy network she had helped build. The modest brick building stood in a quiet neighborhood where colorful murals covered the walls and children's laughter drifted through the open windows. There were no crystal chandeliers, no marble floors, and no photographers waiting at the entrance. Instead, volunteers arranged books on shelves while parents greeted one another with grateful smiles. Margaret stepped inside carrying a box of donated children's books. Weeks earlier, she would have expected someone else to handle such a task. Now she carried it herself without hesitation. Richard spent the morning assembling reading tables alongside local volunteers, stopping often to listen as teachers described the difference a safe learning environment made in a child's future. Victoria sat on the floor reading storybooks with a small group of children who laughed every time she attempted different character voices. None of them recognized the Brooks family name, and for the first time, none of that seemed to matter. Daniel watched quietly as his parents and sister embraced a world they had once overlooked. Emily moved naturally through the center, greeting teachers by their first names, asking students about their favorite books, and thanking every volunteer before they left for the day. She looked exactly as she had at the family dinner weeks before, dressed simply, smiling gently, treating every person with the same steady respect. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else now saw her. During lunch, Margaret sat beside Emily beneath the shade of a large maple tree outside the center. "I spent years believing that influence came from being admired," she admitted softly. "Watching you these past few weeks has taught me that real influence comes from helping other people believe in themselves." Emily smiled. "My parents used to tell me that every person leaves something behind. Some leave buildings. Some leave fortunes. The luckiest people leave hope." Margaret reached for Emily's hand. "Thank you for giving our family another chance." Emily gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you for taking it." Richard soon joined them carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I have already spoken with our foundation board," he said. "We are creating a long-term partnership with these literacy programs, and I would like you to help us learn how to serve communities instead of simply funding them." Emily nodded with quiet appreciation. "That would mean more than you know." As the afternoon came to an end, Charles Whitmore arrived unexpectedly to visit the center. He smiled as he watched the Brooks family working alongside volunteers rather than standing apart from them. Turning to Daniel, he quietly remarked, "The greatest success is never changing someone's reputation. It is changing someone's heart." Daniel looked across the room where Emily was helping a young student choose a new book to take home. "She has been doing that since the day I met her," he replied proudly. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, families began heading home carrying backpacks filled with books and renewed confidence for the future. The Brooks family lingered for a moment outside the center, not because they were reluctant to leave, but because they understood that the most important journey of their lives had not begun at a gala or inside a mansion. It had begun the moment they chose to look beyond appearances and recognize the quiet dignity that had been standing before them all along. And on that day, they finally learned that true wealth is never measured by what a person owns, but by the respect they freely give before they know who someone truly is.